Many, many years ago, Tom de Waal invited me to Covent Garden to a little tea house because he was interested in getting involved in the Caucasus. I thought this is not a good career move, but it turned out to be an amazing career move, as he was connected with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and long stint in the United States, where he let me house sit for his house when they went away and take care of their hamster, which I kept alive somehow. And so we've been friends for a long time. And I'm just going to refer to a couple of books because the range of what he's studied is extraordinary. His first book in 1999 was Chechnya, Calamity in the Caucasus. Then he wrote a major work on Karabakh, which translates, of course, from Turkish as Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan through peace and war. Then he wrote a bigger book on the Caucasus, a whole introduction with Oxford University Press in 2010. He wrote a book, Great Catastrophe. You know, this is what Armenians call Metzirern. Instead of using the word genocide, we now call it Stera-Smanuchun. We call it genocide, but he didn't, or was reluctant to, but we fought about that over time. But he did say in the same book, Great Catastrophe, Armenians and Turks in the Shadow of Genocide. Not enough, he goes beyond that, beyond frozen conflict, scenarios for the separatist disputes of Eastern Europe. And finally, and he'll talk about this when we get to Yerevan, he translated Tristia by Osip Mandelstam, and we're going to have an evening about this poet and so forth. So now Tom is going to talk about this fascinating subject because he's interested and even writing a book, we hope, called About the Black Sea. He's going to talk about Batum in flux. Tom.
Thanks so much, Ron. There are a small group of people who I regard as my Caucasus kindred spirits, and you're very much one of them, so it's a great pleasure to be sitting with you today. So I'm going to talk a bit about the city we're in. I'm very conscious that Ruslan or Harrison should be giving this talk, but I'll give a sort of more of an outsider's perspective on the city we're in. Batumi. It's in part the story of how Batum became Batumi. And let me start, I think there's a bit of a Greek theme to all of our presentations. We've had the Byzantines and Orthodox in what Valentina's been talking about. Dominic referenced Plato and Aristotle. So let me start with a proposition that the Black Sea has been at its most open and dynamic when it's been a sea of mercantile city-states, and it's been that 3 times in its history, once in the ancient world, once in the early medieval period when the Italians were also big traders here, particularly in Crimea, and also in the 19th century, I would say, when some of these Black Sea cities were big trade routes, particularly Odessa and Trabzon. And in that company, Batumi is a bit of a late comer, but a very significant one, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So just look at this map for a moment. You can see, incidentally, I should have mentioned this yesterday, Troy. I think a much more convincing explanation for the Trojan War is not cherchez la femme, it's not Helen, but the Greeks wanted passage to the Black Sea through the Straits, and Troy was getting in their way, and they needed to capture Troy. I think there's a much more strong economic rationale for the Trojan War, which wouldn't have made such a great poem by Homer, but I think is absolutely the explanation, is that the Greeks wanted passage through the Straits to the Black Sea, and then you have a succession, this is, in the ancient world, a succession of Greek city-states. Up there you've got Odysseus, which becomes Varna, then you've got Tomis, which was where Ovid was exiled, becomes Constantia. Those are still, Chersonis is next door to Sevastopol. Up here we've got Theodosia, which went for many years under Kaffa and then was returned to Theodosia. Around here you've got Dioscurius, which is basically Sukhumi. Phasis is, I think, basically Poti, the river Phasis, which incidentally I think is the origin of the pheasant. The bird came from the river Phasis, and so if you ever see a pheasant in Poti, that's where it comes from. And then this ancient city, how do I pronounce it? Pichdvari, is just north of here, of Batum. And then you've also got Trapezon around here, Sinop, and of course Constantinople. So many of these Greek city-states still functioning. And then I'm going to also, Yuri, and I mentioned this yesterday, has a, I love Yuri's classification of peoples into this, in your book, The Jewish Century, I mentioned this yesterday, into Apollonians who work the soil, and Mercurians who are the traders and mercantile people, and the Jews in the 19th century. But before that, I think the Greeks performed that function on the Black Sea as people, the people of the sea, the merchants, the traders. And I think that's a particularly Black Sea phenomenon. And so here we are, again, with some of those same cities as we saw in the ancient world, still functioning as ports. And of course, Batumi now joins them basically in the end of the 19th century and becomes a kind of, its kin cities, if anything, are Odessa, a kind of cosmopolitan city in the Russian Empire, and Baku, also another cosmopolitan city. And what was grain for Odessa, the big driver of wealth, was oil trading for Batumi. Of course, Odessa getting its grain from the Ukrainian Black Earth plains, and Batumi getting its oil from Baku. So this, I think, okay, and this is my theme of a cosmopolitan city, a city of many nationalities. And the so-called, this is, I guess, from about 1900, I couldn't date this picture, when this was still called Batum. Let me just read you a couple of quotes to describe this phenomenon of a Black Sea city of many nationalities. A 1913 Russian guidebook describing this city. Georgians predominantly are salesmen, tavern keepers, cooks, servants, bartenders, carriage drivers. The Armenians are traders and shopkeepers, porters, draymen. The Greeks are bakers, shoemakers, blanket makers, traders. The Persians are gardeners, vegetable and fruit growers, keepers of eating houses and tea houses. The Turks are fishermen, felucca sailors, port workers, keepers of coffee houses. The Jews are traders. The Ajarans, meaning the kind of local Georgian-speaking Muslim population, are immigrant peasants, farmers, and wardens, the most Apollonian in this group. Apart from that, there are a lot of foreigners, thanks to the many different offices and steamship companies. And I think there was indeed, I think, a cricket club in this city because of the British presence. And then let me also quote Mandelstam, who I've translated as Ron said, who wrote a wonderful essay sketch about this city. He was here in 1921 when the Bolsheviks had just taken over, but still describes this vibrant mercantile city. And he says, the mechanism controlling this tiny toy-like town, raised by the conditions of our times to the status of a Russian-style California gold rush city, is extraordinarily simple. It rests on one mainspring, the Turkish lira. The exchange rate of the lira alters by night, as it were, when the town is fast asleep, for in the morning the inhabitants wake up to a new exchange rate, no one knowing quite how it all happened. The lira pulses in the blood of every Batumian. Indeed, it is the bakers who announce the morning rate with the morning bread. So he's describing a city in which basically nationality takes second place to commerce. The same could very much be said of Odessa and Baku in the same period. But of course that's, and we'll talk about that, that's also a very precarious condition for a state to be. And also, all of these cities, I think, would love to have been free ports if such a thing could ever have been sustainable city-states, but in the age of the nation-state, that proved impossible. So in the 1870s, Batum was still a Turkish city of a large village, probably, a small town of about 5,000 people. Then, under the Treaty of San Stefano of 1878, it's taken by the Russian Empire and starts to transform into something like this. Very similar story in Odessa, an Ottoman fortress, which then acquires this sort of 19th century gridiron pattern, neoclassical architecture, Europeanization, obviously a lot of port infrastructure, which we're seeing on the right of the picture. Now, I'm actually, so I'd need Ruslan or someone to tell me exactly where we are on this map. We're in the sort of vertical street in the middle. Yeah, okay, perfect, yeah. As I said, in the middle of the picture, I did get that right. And of course, we're looking out still at the tankers, which were the, yeah, okay. Anyway, let's not get too diverted by that. But the key point is, Dominic mentioned, how South Africa in the 1870s, who cared? There was no resources there. The same could have been true of Baku in the 1840s. It was a little kind of Persian, charming old Persian town with a caravanserai. They had these funny flames coming out of the ground, but 1846, suddenly a big gusher comes out. 1860s, people start to develop the first technology to develop that. And Baku suddenly becomes an oil town in the 1870s. Suddenly the Russian Empire realizes it has a very important asset, and suddenly the world starts to arrive in Baku and completely transform that city, including all sorts of people who also are in Batumi, the Nobels and the Rothschilds. But there's a problem, which is the topography of the Caucasus. The first oil tankers, go across the Caspian Sea to Astrakhan, to the Volga. It's an incredibly complicated route to get that oil anywhere except the Russian Empire. And the Caucasus is still divided by these highlands, in particular the Surami highlands in western Georgia, and until the Transcaucasian Railway starts to be built. And its first branch opens in 1883, connecting Baku and Batumi. So this is a perennial problem for Baku, is you have the oil, how do you get it to market, which was a problem also in the 1990s, and when they eventually came up with the Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline. Similar problem in the 1880s, and you end up building a railway, and suddenly Batumi becomes the key outlet on the other side, but not before you had to get over the Surami Pass and build this tunnel, which was completed in 1890. It helped that the Nobels were there because their dynamite was absolutely essential in blasting through the mountain. And I would argue, actually, I've made this argument in a lecture about the Caucasus, that the South Caucasus was only really became one region when this tunnel was completed. Before that, it was basically a big west-east division in which the western side was basically a Black Sea territory with heavy Ottoman domination, and then even when the Russians took over was a very different entity, and the east side was first Persian and then a very different entity. Georgia suddenly became one country, logistically in 1890 when this was Surami Tunnel was opened. And it's just there, again, the trick with the pointer, but it goes up just on the left of your map, goes through that highland and down to the sea to Batumi, which is where we are. And then, so this suddenly opens up lots of perspectives. The Nobels and the Rothschilds come to Batumi. In 1883, the Batumske Neftepromyshlenное и торговое общество, known as Benito, is founded by the Rothschilds using Baku oil and trading it to the West. And the vice president, but de facto manager of this corporation is a man called Morris Ephrussi, who's actually my great-uncle, because the Ephrussis of Odessa had moved to Paris, but Morris was born in 1849, a fluent Russian speaker. He then married Alphonse de Rothschild's daughter, and Alphonse sent his son-in-law, Russian-speaking son-in-law, off to the Caucasus to work in Baku and Batumi, and became the head of this Benito. So the result of this is that if in 1884, 67% of the world's oil was being produced by the US, and the Russian Empire, which basically means Baku and a bit in the North Caucasus, was 33%. 9 years later, thanks to this railway, 53% was coming from the US and 47% from the Russian Empire, from Baku. Thanks to the railway and obviously increased technology, it could handle much bigger volumes of oil, and Batumi and that railway were absolutely key. And then another little digression, but I think it's important. This ship, Murex, the story there is that an East End Jewish London businessman called Marcus Samuel came to the Caucasus in 1890. In 1891, he did a 9-year exclusive deal with the Rothschilds, saying that he could sell their oil not just across the Black Sea, but through the Suez Canal and to the Asian market, to Singapore. And the Rothschilds had helped finance the Suez Canal, and so he was able to do a deal for transit through the Suez Canal, and he built this very much more sturdy and impressive oil tanker called the Murex, which could carry 4,000 tons. And in 1892, there was this daring journey. Standard Oil, the American company, had been supplying Singapore and a very long way around, but suddenly, if you could get through the Suez Canal, it was a shorter route, and suddenly Rothschild Baku oil arrived in Singapore thanks to Marcus Samuel and his tanker, and they suddenly started supplying the Far East as well, and that was a huge breakthrough. Samuel called his tanker Murex after a seashell. He named subsequent tankers all after seashells, and he's the founder of Shell Oil, and that's the origin of etymology of Shell Oil in this town. But there's obviously a darker, literally a blacker side to the story, which is obviously, as in Baku, the workers were, the Rothschilds and the Nobels and the Samuels were earning big fortunes, but the workers were living in cramped conditions in what was called in both Baku and in Batumi, the Black Town, because it was filthy and polluted. And here is the railway arriving in the Black Town of Batumi. And that led to social tensions, workers' rights, and the socialist revolutionaries had lots of room for mobilization in both Baku and Batumi, both of which became revolutionary towns. And here a key figure in both places was the young Joseph Djougashvili, Stalin, who lived in both Baku and in Batumi. in, Ron will tell me the year, I think it was 1901, 1902, Stalin, there's a mysterious fire at the warehouse, Rothschild warehouse in Batumi, which is attributed to Stalin, and he's then thrown in jail. We then have further expansion of the importance of this city in 1907 with the opening of the world's first so-called kerosene pipeline from Baku to Batumi, Batum running the course of the railway, 885 kilometers, 16 pumping stations. So we're talking about, again, this city from being an Ottoman village just 30, 40 years before is a key link, a key point of communication in the new globalization of the late 19th, early 20th century. So let me see, then we come to the First World War, and the Ottomans take over Baku between April and December they take over Batum in April to December 1918. As far as they're concerned, this is still a Turkish city. It's just been temporarily handed over to the Russians. And here I think we see an interesting perspective in these two nation states next to each other, Georgia and Turkey. There's a very plausible alternative history in which Batum stays Batum, keeps under Turkish control, and looks like Rize or Trabzon today, a fully Turkish city with a few nice old Russian-style buildings, but is a fully Turkified city. But the Turks, and this is, sorry, by the way, this is Enver Pasha, someone who
We love him, yeah.
Ron has written very fondly about, one of the three Pashas who are also responsible for the Armenian genocide and for much war and destruction in the Caucasus. Here he is arriving still as an Ottoman officer before he becomes more of a pan-Turkist in the middle of 1918, greeted by certain crowds. And there's a kind of swing, I don't know if Ruslan will agree with me, there's a sort of a swing population. The Ajarans are both Muslim and Georgian speaking, so they can adapt both to Ottoman rule and to subsequent Georgian rule, and which, as it were, mobilizes different parts of their identity. But under the Ottomans, of course, lose the First World War, and the British suddenly become players in the Black Sea at the end of 1918. And the British are, in 1919, are in control of much of the Transcaucasus, of Baku, Batumi, and Tiflis, Tbilisi. But the one place they eventually hold on to is Batumi. And let's think of this city as a place which had very different and many claimants. The Turks, obviously, the Georgian Mensheviks, who found their own republic in 1918, Denikins, White Russians, and ultimately and finally successfully the Bolsheviks as well. So the fact that the British take over and the British aren't obviously in there for the long run, I think is something which the Georgian Mensheviks accept a bit reluctantly, but as possibly a better security guarantee than any of the other players that they can see. And so for a while, this city, 1919 basically, and the first half of 1920 is a little British protectorate. And here they are in the city, marching in formation. And here's a description in Beckhofer's book about this period. And He says, in any restaurant in Batum, you could see ladies of good family and education waiting upon speculators and their prostitute companions, while outside in the rain, a Russian officer, too badly wounded, too demoralized, or too much bound by family ties to be able to join Denikin's army, could be seen carrying the portmanteau of a fat Odessa merchant who had just brought off a fine speculative deal with the currency, with foodstuffs, or with clothing or drugs. A clear aristocratic prejudice there in Beckhofer, but he's welcoming the British because they are the salvations of what's left of Russian imperial Batumi. Then in 1919, and there's some good academic articles on this, the British are debating what to do. Do they really want to hang on, or can they hang on to the Caucasus? There's a debate between the War Office, which is very skeptical, says we really don't have the military manpower to do this, and the Foreign Office, embodied by Lord Curzon, who says that in the interests of India and the empire to keep this foothold for as long as possible. And there's a sort of compromise, which is the British do stay, but they basically just keep 2 battalions here, mainly actually Indian soldiers. And at one point, Curzon suggests that this become a free port under League of Nations mandate, which I think would have been a quite nice fate for it, but of course that's not a trend which is going to persist in the geopolitics of this era. In April 1920, Churchill is saying that we should pull out of the Caucasus, the Bolsheviks arriving. April 1920 is when the Bolsheviks then arrive in Baku, and the game seems to be up. And this is basically the way that the Bolsheviks take this region. They come down the Caspian Sea coast, they take Baku, which is the first and most important prize economically because of its economic and oil importance. They then proceed west into Karabakh, they take that, they then proceed December 1920 into Armenia, and in February 1921 they're ready to advance north into Georgia, taking Tbilisi in Tiflis in February 1921, which leaves Batumi as the last outpost. And by this time, the British, by the way, these slides are actually in the wrong order, the British have left in July 1920. The Bolsheviks, it's basically a contest at this point in 1921 between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks about who will control this city. The Mensheviks lose, obviously, to the Bolsheviks in Tbilisi, and it's the last act of the Georgian Democratic Republic is played out in this city, and the Turks come back in March 1921 for basically 2 or 3 days. They take this city, and the Georgians can be thankful to this person, the Menshevik general, Georgi Mazniashvili. I had to share a picture of him and his magnificent moustaches with you. He's the savior of this city, and there's a brief kind of accommodation between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks that they are fighting a war over Georgia, but neither of them want the Turks to take this city. So the Bolsheviks basically give a free hand to Mazniashvili to drive the Turks out before they themselves arrive in the city. And this allows the last act. This is an oil painting from the Batumi Museum, so it has very little historical accuracy probably. But a ship, is it a French ship or an Italian ship, takes the Mensheviks out of this city. I think it's called the Ernest Renan, after the man who writes about the birth of nations, so that, make of that what you want. In March the 17th, 1921, the Menshevik government, basically headed by Jordania, basically comes to the quayside and is allowed to go into exile in Europe, in Paris, and this is the last act of the Menshevik government of democratic Georgia happens on the quayside just over here. And then the Bolsheviks take over. And the Bolsheviks, and this is not going to be I'm going to end here, but just to say briefly, the Bolsheviks do make an accommodation with Batumi and Adjara's very special history and status and make it an autonomous republic of Adjara, an autonomous status that it still preserves, at least nominally, to this day within Georgia, that we're in an autonomous republic in Georgia. So that's my theme. This is very much after the magnificent sweeping histories we've had from Dominic and Valentina. This is very much a microcosm. But I do see kind of bigger themes here about how, and I see that in Odessa as well, how a cosmopolitan city on the Black Sea could not really survive the geopolitics of the 20th century and the emergence of the nation state. I think, and that loss, I think, is to the detriment of to the mercantile energy and dynamism of this city, and indeed of all the other Black Sea cities, such as Odessa. But that is something that I think is to the loss of the Black Sea as an economic region in the 20th century, and still something that has not properly been revived. But on the cultural and architectural level, I think that cosmopolitan mercantile flavor still endures, and we'll see some of that in our tour with Ruslan this afternoon.
Thank you, Tom. That was great.